Hello, Bob Wells here. Welcome to the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive into the hidden depths of the world around us. In fact, today we're going to explore other worlds. And if you're a fan of science fiction, you're in for a real treat. Our guest today is none other than Steve Carroll, the brilliant mind behind his new book, Diaspora. But before we dive into our conversation, I've got a few questions for you. What do you love most about science fiction? Is it the futuristic technology, the exploration of new worlds, or the deep philosophical questions it raises? Which science fiction book, movie, or series has had the greatest impact on you, and why? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share your answers with us on social media. And now, without further ado, let's welcome our guest, Steve Carroll.
Hi, Bob. Really nice to be here.
It's great to have you on. I should really have said welcome back, shouldn't I, really?
All right, yeah.
Before we talk about your life as an author, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your life's journey, and how you got into writing, please?
Okay, well, last time I spoke on this wonderful podcast, I was talking about visual art and the fact that I make my living as a art and art history teacher. And but originally that wasn't the route I wanted to go down. I wanted to be a writer when I was really quite young, and I loved writing stories at school, and I even used to try writing stories in my own spare time. And when I was around 12, I was our form teacher at school. I don't know if you remember, Bob, a man called Peter Courthampton.
Yes.
And he was a great teacher. He was one of those really inspiring teachers who, has an effect on your life. And he loved science fiction, and he used to read us in English. He used to read us science fiction stories, short stories by Ray Bradbury. And I loved these stories because they were all about ideas, and they weren't necessarily about how the spacecraft worked or that type of what we might call hard science fiction. They used the science fiction template really to discuss ideas. And I can remember him once giving me detention, and I had to write an essay, and I just went, yes, like that, and he laughed because he realised asking me to write wasn't a punishment; it was a pleasure. And I started writing, and I actually wrote my first novel when I was around 12. It was terrible, but the fact is, I was a 12-year-old, and I had written a lot, and took it very seriously. And my parents didn't really know what to do with me. I went to the careers office, at school. The careers officer would say, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to be a writer." And they kind of laugh because we went to secondary modern school, and we were supposed to be, bricklayers and things like that, or engineers or things like that. And they just didn't know what to do. And they sort of said, you've got to do something sensible. And the other thing that influenced on my life was a very bad teacher. We had a teacher, I won't mention his name, he's probably not with us anymore, but do you remember his nickname was Slug?
Yes, I do. Yes.
And he also taught English, and he did not like me. And he used to give me top marks for any sort of composition. But he used to mock my writing, and he used to read bits I'd written out to the rest of the class, sort of in a mocking tone, and getting the class to laugh at me. And that was very difficult.
Very, very good for you. Very good for your confidence, Steve. Not.
Oh, it was great. Very, very professional, And at that time, we had another teacher called Dave Dibb, who was a wonderful art teacher, and he was the one who gave me confidence in visual art. And so that's why I went down the visual art route. But I've always wanted to be a writer. I've always had ideas. I couldn't stop having ideas for stories, usually sci-fi stories. And when in about the mid-90s, I had a business. I had a graphic design business, and I had to close it down. The recession and the lots of different economic factors, I had to close it down. I was very down and in a really bad place. And I decided to get myself out of that place. I decided to write a novel. I wrote it, and I sent it out to some agents to see if they would recommend it to publishers. I did get an agent. They said it was very good. It was sent to Orion Publishers, who are a big sci-fi publishing house, who said they read it with interest but decided not to publish it. Now, I was told later by a cousin of mine who's a published author, that's actually a very good result. When they say they read it with interest but didn't publish it, it meant it couldn't have been bad. Yeah. And what then happened was, moving forwards to around about the year 2000, I'm another agent, and he was an agent for graphic novel publishers, and publishing. And we got, he basically took this story idea to a publisher. And one day I got, and we were going to turn it into a graphic novel, which is like a comic book, and it would be for teenagers. But I think it would still be good, good fun. And I thought, and he phoned me up once and said, "I've got good news and bad news about your book." And I said, "Oh, what's the good news?" He said, "Somebody wants to publish it." I said, "That's great. What's the bad news?" He says, "He wants it set in the 12th century." And I said, "But it's a cyberpunk, sci-fi novel. How can I do that?" It's all right. I told him we could change it. I thought, oh, great. And I ended up changing it into a story about the Crusades, which involved alchemy. And it was published. And the artist who illustrated it was a chap called Jeff Anderson, who is well known for illustrating Judge Dredd.
Oh yeah,
you know Judge Dredd, yeah. And so that was a coup. We got the first two books published, but to be quite frankly, the publisher didn't really. He was new, breaking into graphic novels. He didn't really know what he was doing, but it was a great experience turning it into a graphic novel and being fresh. I had my 15 minutes of fame with that. Yeah. And then, and that's basically it. And then what happened? I think it was around about the time of COVID. I think we all had time on our hands, and I think a lot of people did some very creative stuff on their own in that time. I was by then teaching at a college, and I was teaching art, and there was another. I made friends with somebody who was teaching creative writing, and I said, well, I dabbled with that myself, and this was a very very nice lady, and she was into sci-fi, which I don't want to sound. Be careful what I say, but there is a stereotype that sci-fi is just for men, but it's not. There's lots of very influential female writers in sci-fi and lovers of sci-fi, and she said she's writing a space opera. Now, space opera is I have to define what that is. Science fiction. Originally, what science fiction meant was it is fiction which revolves around a scientific idea. So your namesake, H.G. Wells, when he wrote War of the Worlds and the Time Machine, he was actually exploring scientific ideas. It's an adventure story, yes, but what he was doing was in the Time Machine, he was looking at things like evolution, and so is War of the Worlds is to some extent about that. And so he was discussing these scientific ideas. But Star Wars, it does not discuss scientific ideas. Star Wars is what we call space opera, in that it's a story set in space.
Oh yeah,
and this, you get the idea. And this lady, she said she was writing a space opera, and I thought, gosh, wouldn't that be good? To invent new worlds and new civilizations. That would be great. And what started forming in my head was this idea for something involving lots of different, planets. But I decided what I was going to do is I was going to restrict myself, and I was not going to have aliens, and I wasn't going to have any of the sort of sci-fi tropes. There would be no aliens, there would be no laser weapons, there would be no artificial gravity, no tractor beams, no energizers, all that type of thing. I would just have what we know about science now. So it would be, have what we call a hard science fiction side to it. And that I found really helpful. When I was turning my novel into a graphic novel set in the medieval world, I did a lot of research on the 12th century. And, I would go into the library and get out, the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Medieval Life and all this type of thing, and I would just read through things, and the history inspired ideas. And with this, I've actually found it far more inspiring if you kept your science really tight, so it wasn't fantastical science. It was kind of within the realms of possibility. And I actually found that really inspiring and a really good way to construct, a story around that type of world. And the only thing that it has, which is a bit fantastical, is that the main spacecraft in the story has what I call a wormhole generator, and that is something which will create a gravity field in front of it of infinitely huge amount of gravity, which will pull the spacecraft faster than light,
Yeah.
which I don't know what the science of that is, but if you were going to be realistic, it's a story where in 6,000 years' time, human beings have colonized other planets, but these planets are spread out in different solar systems, and they would take light years. They're light years away. They would take hundreds of years to reach.
Yeah.
And so you have to get there in a couple of days. Yeah. So therefore, I created this thing which allows you to get from planet to planet within days, like in Star Trek.
And I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book, Steve, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it and can recommend it. What Diaspora, I think I've pronounced that correctly. What does that actually mean?
Well, it means diaspora is where you have people who are like a race who are spread out through the world. So you talk in terms of the Jewish diaspora.
Oh yeah.
Or in the case of my family, because I'm from an Irish background, we talk about the Irish diaspora, which is England. A lot of Irish people in America, obviously. That's what it means. It just means spread out. And so what you've got is the human race spread out across the known galaxy.
Yes. Okay. So you told us a bit about the book, and we can go into it a bit more, a bit further on. Is science fiction the main genre that you tend to read, Steve?
No, not read, not read, but it's what I write. Yeah. I read all sorts of things, and I like I like detective, things. I like whodunits. I like I like a bit of horror.
Yeah.
I like I read a lot of personal biographies in my my role as a art history teacher. I'm reading the lives of artists a lot, but science fiction is the sort of the world I think in. And if I could explain what something that might be helpful to explain what I love about science fiction, there's an old a story that Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, used to tell, and he used to say it's called Plato's Cave. You may have heard of it.
Yeah.
And it's where he says, imagine that you've got some people who are born in a cave facing the walls, and all they can see is the shadows of the world around them, and they don't see and then basically they will think that is what reality is. Reality is those shadows. And I've heard people say, oh, that's ridiculous, it's so contrived. But it's not the contrivedness that is interesting about that. What is interesting about that is, how it applies to life. Our experience of life is limited, and you can go all around the world and you'll still bits of the world you won't see. Our experience of life is, and it's a way of saying something quite profound, but in quite a contrived way. And I think of science fiction like that. I think of it as being like getting into, a different world, getting outside this world, and finding a way of discussing ideas and discussing, and maybe reflecting on our own reality by looking at a parallel world. That's what science fiction means to me. And my favourite science fiction writer is Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick wrote the original story to Blade Runner. It was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And it's very different. The book is very different from the film. And other films have been made of his work, things like Minority Report, The Adjustment Bureau, usually some very strange, weird sci-fi stories. The ideas come from the mind of Philip K. Dick, and he was very much about that. He was very much about using the science fiction world to explore and reflect back on our own world.
Very, very interesting. I can sort of see that in as much as I think when I was a child, I sort of thought that as I got older, I'd actually know more and more and more about the world. But I think the reverse is true. I think the older I get, the less I realise I know, which I suppose is quite a healthy way of looking at it.
And you shut up more.
Yes.
You realise you don't.
Yeah. This podcast is a good education for me on that. So just to listen.
Okay.
Just on, I mean, there's two sort of areas of the book that fascinated me. One was the different themes that it touches. There's a lot of different themes which I'd like you to talk about if you will in a minute. But the other thing, and we've already touched on it, is the scientific and technological knowledge that you personally have on a lot of these. And you mentioned that they tended to be existing technologies that you were looking at, apart from the one about making the craft's own wormholes. I mean, there's a lot of information about technology on that. What would you say about that?
Well, I think my dad was an aircraft engineer. He's retired now. He's an aircraft engineer. So I grew up knowing how aircraft flew, and I grew up knowing about the sort of the basic physics of flight and why a cabin is pressurized and all sorts of things, because he used to, his job was taking aircraft apart, inspecting them and putting them back together, so he knew aircraft inside out. And so I grew up with just, that knowledge of how aircraft work. And I was fascinated by the space program. I was fascinated by the Apollo moon landings, which did happen, and which, but all the sort of, the technicalities of that and what they had to do, what they didn't have to do. That was kind of just something I grew up with. And when I put the spacecraft together, in the book, I thought in terms of, right, well, it won't have artificial gravity. I've no idea how artificial gravity is supposed to work. You just take it for granted in Star Wars and Star Trek, but I don't know how that's worked. So what they have is they have a revolving rim, and it generates gravity. And then I thought to myself, it would only be people living on the outside of that rim that would have Earth-type normal gravity. As you go towards the centre, the gravity would become less. So I then thought to myself, well, you could use that in the story where you have a hierarchy within the group, and you have this. The spacecraft is run by an organisation called the Party. And the higher you are in the party, the more Earth-like gravity you get. And so the lower you are, the less gravity you get. And, it was things like that. I thought I could actually add, that could become part of the story. Yeah. And the rest is things like knowing about retro rockets, knowing that how, this is just knowing how the lunar module landed on the moon, how it steered. It used these retro rockets. And so, you have things like that. And, just as the, I think the gravity was the most important thing. That was the thing that I thought was the biggest sort of problem, and what would make it seem unlike other science fiction stories. The fact that people are floating around,
Yeah, so it's your basic interest and knowledge of the science part of it that goes right back, and the technological part that goes right back to your childhood. Just on the subject of the main protagonist in the book, the professor, without sort of giving any spoilers away. I mean, he to me is he's a good guy. Could you just sort of, without sort of spoilers, could you just tell listeners a little bit about him and what he's like and what he believes in, please?
Yeah, well, he's and this is basically what the drive of the story is, that he is a history professor in a university, and he's about my age. He's approaching retirement, and his whole life has been the love of history and also the love of culture. And the other thing that the other side of him is he's a great debater, and he a bit like C.S. Lewis in Oxford was actually, I think he was the chair of the debating society, and they still have the Oxford Union debates. He's a great debater who usually wins debates and is a little bit smug and a little bit proud about that. And what happens, and this is the sort of the main idea of the story, is that one day he's outside the college doing a bit of bird watching, and he suddenly turns round, and there are these alien spacecraft, and they are just destroying the university. And he then becomes a refugee, and then he finds out that the aliens have attacked the planet, but they've only destroyed the arts and culture, the humanities departments of universities, and they've destroyed all the art galleries and all the places of cultural interest. And he doesn't, he just cannot understand it. What's going on. And the thing is, as a historian, he's got no more data. All the universes are destroyed. The universes are destroyed, and he decides the only thing he's got is his reason. And, he's got his ability to debate, his ability to argue his case. And so, therefore, he sets off on a mission to confront the aliens and debate with them what they've done, which sounds like a comical idea. And it is, it is a comical idea, but there's a serious side to it. That's why the subtitle of the book is "When Your Only Weapon is Reason," because he's got nothing else. And this story is like a journey of discovery, where he not just finds out, why, something of why the aliens have done this, but he finds out something about himself as well. That's basically the story.
No, it's a fascinating read, and there's a lot of echoes with near future situations that we could possibly face on our world, and particularly with the machine wars and AI basically sort of outgrowing itself and becoming an intelligence in itself, which a lot of people are fearful of. So it certainly touches a lot of themes.
Yeah, it does, and I'm glad you brought up the AI side, because that's another aspect of the story. I need to point out that the Diaspora is the first book. It's actually going to be I've got 3 more books. And one of them I'm just editing and just doing the final bits on, and there's another one I've started. But what we call, there's a reference to a time in the past, which is about 500 years in the past, called the Machine Wars, which is your classic sort of like in Terminator, or those type of films. It's a war between mankind and the machines that they've created. One of the inspirations, I have inspirations from lots of different places, not just from actual science fiction, but also from what's going on in the world today. One of my favorite, my favorite, I think, documentary maker is Adam Curtis, and I don't know whether you know his work. You can find his work on iPlayer. He's got a series of films. One is "I Can't Get You Out of My Head," and one is "Hypernormalization" by Adam Curtis. The fantastic documentary is very interestingly made. But one of the things he points out in that is that artificial intelligence works differently to us as humans. We as humans, we read stories and we explain our lives in terms of stories. And the thing about artificial intelligence is it doesn't do that. Artificial intelligence just sees data and tries to make connections. And so it sees the world in a very different way. And that's one of the important aspects of the story. It is a story itself, but within the story is the fact that we base our lives, and we think in terms of stories. And whether it's a big story like the Bible, which people like myself, actually we use it to understand life. Or if you go back to the Greek classics, and the classics which are still taught, today. I believe the reason why the classics from ancient Greece are so powerful is because they touch on. There's just so many of them, and they touch on so many different aspects and obscure aspects of life. So we use stories to understand ourselves, and whereas machines don't. And that's one of the sort of the problems that I'm actually looking at in the book.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot of stuff like that in the book, and we could talk about it all day. But of course, my recommendation would be for people to read the book, because there's so much in there. And I was also getting a feeling of some of the people in the book are very much manipulated, and we know from history that it's very easy for a population to be manipulated by a leader. And we look back to the Second World War and all the rest of it, and just sort of go along like sheep, not actually thinking about things. And you touch on quite a lot of that. How important was that? How important was that facet of it for for the book?
It was something where I kind of started thinking in terms of why people believe things. I mean, one of the things about when you've been around the block, Bob, is you look back on what you were like as a a kid, as a teenager. And a teenager, when you start thinking seriously about things, we were at school. We used to have talks about politics, all sorts of things, and the reason why you believe things, and you often realise you believe often something your parents tell you, and and whatever the environment is, and when the environment changes, people believe something completely different, and you look back and you can see different trends and you think to yourself, how objective was I? How objective was anybody about the data, about the facts? When we are in this milieu, and I think it's a very important thing, and this is another theme in the book. When you destroy culture, you don't know where you've come from. I don't think people know. Where our culture, what our culture is based on, what our history is based on, and they might get very surprised. I've been looking at data about how, during the slave trade, it was actually black Africans who were selling black people to the white people, and that there were black people actually involved in the slave trade, and that kind of like changes. It's shocking.
Yeah.
The slave trade is something I think is obviously believe is absolutely dreadful, but it's not easy enough just to say, oh, it was the fault of Europeans. There were lots of different slave trades. The Barbary pirates, enslaved a million, European people. You need to get to the facts, and before you shout out your opinions. And again, it's something I think as you get older, you get better at doing that.
Yeah, you do, and I think you enter different paradigms, like you were saying, and I think that's very useful to do. How long did it take you to write the book, Steve?
Well, the shortest bit is writing it. Actually going all the way through. The longest bit is editing it, and I don't know. I think it took me. I have to point out it's a short book. It's 35,000 words, and most publishers want 50,000 words at least. Back in the golden age of science fiction, when Ray Bradbury and all these people, Philip K. Dick were writing, you could get away easily with 35,000 words. But I think it's just the economics of things. I think people want 50,000 words. But I would say man hours, it was probably, a week or so in man hours, but it was spread out, because I do other things, and I have to do teaching preparation, and it got spread out. But it's like once you've written it, that's one thing, and then you go back over it and you find all these spelling mistakes and bad sentence construction. And then I liked it so much. I was really proud of what I created. And I sent it to a couple of friends, who read avidly, and some read science fiction. And I just said, what do you think? And they thought it's great. They weren't negative about it at all. But then I got the idea. I liked what I'd created so much. I thought this could be a trilogy. And then I started working out what the trilogy would be. And then I thought to myself, in order for that to work, I've got to go back to my first book and kind of like put some little hints at that that will kind of be explained later in the subsequent books. Yeah. So that was another thing. And then I decided, I have a friend who does this self-publishing writing, and he makes a living from it. And I said to him, asked for some advice, and he advised me to get a professional editor. And that was, they're not cheap, but I thought I'd do that. And I sent it to some of the professional editors, and they were positive about it, but they went around and, again, made some corrections to things and had some questions. And then when these questions came back, I thought, they're right. This needs explaining better. And then you go through and you write more. So the longest, most probably, I could say frustrating part is the editing.
Yeah.
But that's probably another, in man hours, that's probably another week, 2 weeks or something. Yeah. When I say a week, I'm talking about, as I say, man hours. It might have been longer than that. I'm not very good at estimating things, but it wasn't something that was, like some people I know write for about a year and then have a, full time and then have a book, at the end of the year. It wasn't as and
the actual concept of the book, I think you said you thought through first, but did you find as you were writing other ideas were coming into your head?
Yeah. Yeah, as I was writing, other ideas were coming into my head. Not only that, but as I was writing, I realised that I should make some of the characters different, that it would work better if they weren't quite the way I first conceived them.
Yeah.
So first of all, Sebastian Shard was quite a sort of a mild-mannered sort of person, and but then I realised if he's going to be somebody who goes and gives the aliens a piece of his mind, he's probably got to be a little bit more brusque.
Yeah.
He's probably got to be a little bit more arrogant to do that. And so I had to sort of like just
sharpen him up a little bit.
Sharpen him up a bit. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And how close are some of the characters that you've put in the book to people you know?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of them are based on people I know. The kind of what you might call the bad guys aren't necessarily based on people I know. They're kind of when you write a bad guy, you've got to be careful. You can't have some kind of pantomime villain who sort of goes ha 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 ha, wait and see, like that. You have to have somebody who could possibly be right.
Right,
and you could understand why they're doing it.
Yeah,
and so the bad guys, I had to think in terms of why are they doing what they're doing? Do we see things like that happening now? Could they possibly be right about what they're doing? And I had to really get into their philosophy of what they're doing and make them sympathetic in some ways. So they're a little bit more, created beings. But a lot of what I would say the nicer people are based on people I know.
Yeah.
The Shard is, first of all, I'm a teacher, approaching retirement. He's a professor approaching retirement. There's a little bit of me in it, but he's not really like me. The person who's most like me there's a character in it called Gerald. And I don't know if you remember, he's right in the beginning, and he comes back later in the book. And he's a little bit over enthusiastic, socially awkward type of person, and that's how I see myself. He's and then there's a family at the beginning, and a lot of people who read the book said, "Why have you got a Muslim family living on a space station?" I think I can say that, and I never say they're Muslims,
No.
but it's obvious that they are. Well, they're based on a Libyan family who I knew and was very friendly with, and this is in the time of Gaddafi and Reagan and Thatcher, and Libyans were thought of as being bad people, but we knew these people and they were very lovely, and we got to know their children. We're still in contact with their kids, we still talk to them, and they're a great family. And so I wanted to start with portraying these people as just people, not as the enemy or anything like that. So they're based on some friends of mine. There's a character in it called Janice, and she's based on a very lovely and very eccentric daughter of one of my best friends, who I've always thought should be a character in a story because she's such an incredible person. But with her, I had to change her. I had to make her a little bit more cynical as the story went on. But she kind of blossoms into this wonderful person, the person I know. And then there's a character in it called Roger, who's like the engineering man, and he's based on the IT technician at my college.
Oh, right.
I always have to call him up and say, look, the computer in the classroom's not working. What's going on, like that? And he has to come and help me out, and he always knows how to fix it. And he's a really nice guy. And I just thought I'd put him in the story as a very
and of course he'll be listening to this podcast. Of course he will. But does he know that? Does he know that he's in this book?
Yeah. No, he doesn't.
Right.
No, he doesn't. I've changed his name.
Yeah. If you give me his email address, I'll email a copy when we publish it. Yeah. And what? So, all in all, how long ago did you actually start this process of this book, then, Steve?
Well, this book I started in during the COVID, during about 2020. Yeah. and it's made up of lots of ideas. But I kind of just sat down and sort of like with a, I should write out notes. I'm not very good at that. But I just basically had it in my head, and I just kind of, you sitting around, there's a lot of time not doing anything, and I was just like thinking to myself, what could happen? What could this be?
Yeah.
One of the things that I was interested in is that because I taught a class on the art of the ancients, which is all about the art of ancient civilizations, and one of the things that I actually realized is just how within a certain space of time. The story, it's 6,000 years in the future. In that time, civilizations can rise and fall.
Yeah.
And one of the idea I thought would be interesting is you've got there's about 6 Earth colonies, planets. And they're all at different stages, because some of them have, there's one which has had a war, and the war has taken them back to the Stone Age. They have to start all over again. And because of this war, they're out of contact with the others. And, and it's all this type of thing. And there's one, the planets, I set it in the 1970s, when I was a teenager. And I try and think of the technology and the attitudes and the thinking of people in the 1970s, which is quite difficult. Different from what it is now.
Yeah, but a time that we remember well. So it would have probably been quite.
Yes, of course we do. When the music was best,
absolutely.
Yeah. And so it and then there's others which are very advanced. There's some which have kind of had hiccups in their development.
Yeah.
So that I thought would be an interesting idea, that they're all Earth planets. There's no aliens. They're all Earth people, but they're at different stages in development.
And all this science fiction, Steve, what are your own thoughts about out in the universe, other planets, other beings, aliens? What are your own thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I don't see any reason why there wouldn't be life on other planets. I don't think it's, the outlook is bleak. The outlook doesn't look as if there is. I know there's people who talk about UFOs landing and things like that, but I'm always a little bit suspicious why that isn't better known. I would have thought if there really was a UFO landing, we would have a little bit more hard evidence than just fuzzy photographs and the testimony of, certain people. There could be life out there. Some of the books I was reading were saying that, actually where we are in the universe, this is about the best place for life to exist. Things about the density of stars, the distance from the sun, and all sorts of things, like the fact that we've got Jupiter in our solar system. Jupiter, those big planets, Jupiter and Saturn, what they do is any harmful, meteorites or comets or things like that, if they come into the solar system, they're usually gobbled up by the huge gravity wells of those planets. That's what happened back in 94. There was the tail of a comet broke off, I understand, and it hit Jupiter. If you don't have a huge planet like that in your solar system, then it could hit the wrong planet. So the balance is incredibly delicate, and if there is no life out there, I wouldn't be surprised.
No. So you've got planets like Jupiter acting as a sort of bouncer of the solar system.
Yeah, they bounce very good. Yes, exactly.
Literally.
Yeah.
What advice would you give? Or two questions on writing, but what advice would you give any listeners who are listening who sort of feel that they'd like to write a book? And the other question sort of related to it, because a lot of it is done now, is what advice would you give somebody who is self-publishing?
Okay. Well, the two things, the advice on writing a book, the two things, one is inspirational, one is practical. For the inspirational side, what I would do is, first of all, it's good to read a lot, read what other people are writing, how writers write. That's good. And look at styles and things like that. That's a good idea. But also, if you're going to write about something you know about. Like you might say to me, well, you don't know anything about aliens from other planets and all this type of thing. But what I was actually writing about was concerns that I have. As an art history teacher, I'm very concerned about how few young people are coming into art history. It tends to be all retired people, and it seems to be, and that was kind of part of the idea behind the story. I mean, at one time I used to hear young people saying, "I don't go to art galleries. I think they should all be closed. All that type of art should be, thrown away." And that was kind of the inspiration for the story. Was my concern that what would happen if we just forgot about our history. And so it's a personal concern of mine and a professional concern of mine. So that was really the germ of the book. So there I am talking about an idea that is close to my heart, and all I've done is I've just set it in space, which I'm able to do because I watch a lot of Star Trek and Star Wars and things like that. So talk about something that I mean, I can, people have often cite someone like Jane Austen. She just wrote about people gossiping and families and people getting married and all that type of thing. She wrote some of the greatest novels ever, just about her own little world. So write about what you know is the first thing, and the second thing about on the practical side is when you're trying to get into it, set aside 1 hour a day for writing. That's what I did. Just say, right, okay, I'm not going to watch something on Netflix. I'm not going to watch whatever. I'm just going to go, and I had a MacBook, a laptop, write it out in Word or whatever the equivalent you've got. If you've got a MacBook, you might have Word, but there's a thing called Pages on Apple, and you can translate that into Word. You can convert it into Word for publishers, and just set aside an hour a day and just get into it. It's amazing, actually, how quick an hour goes, but just an hour a day, and write it, prepare it, write it. And then as you get more excited about it, you're probably going to start spending, an afternoon, or, a whole evening on it, but just 1 hour a day to get into it. And then on the side of self-publishing, I'm quite new to this because this is the first self-published one I did, but I belong to a group called Arran Scribes. This is I live down in Worthing, and the Arran area is going over towards the Littlehampton area, and there's a whole group of writers. You can probably find online a group of writers, and where you live, a writing group, and you ask them what they do. But I was recommended to use Smashwords, which is basically you just send the manuscript through, and and they turn it into a book, and they kind of send you back what the layout of the book is. You don't pay anything, and they then sell it to different people. You get slightly less revenue from that, going to Smashwords. But then I'm using a company called Word to Kindle, which is an online company. It's based in America. Word 2 Kindle, and they're actually putting my book together so it will appear on Kindle. And the other people I approached was Apple Books. Apple Books are distributing it as well.
Oh, well, that's some great advice there. So you mentioned about the trilogy earlier on in the conversation, Steve. Have you started work on your next book?
Oh yes, the next one I'm actually finalising, and then it will go to the editor, and then under the third one I've already started. It's kind of in first draft form. It's not quite finished, but it's I've got the story there, and that's working. One of the things I wanted to do with the trilogy is not have like the same story repeated, or the same type of story repeated. I wanted each one to have a different structure. So the second one is far more character based, and it's based around two brothers.
Okay.
Who actually appear at the end of the first book, and this is like 16 years later, and they're sort of 16 or 13 years later, and they're now teenagers. These young boys, and it's basically their story. Of how they get involved with this big this big thing. And then the third book is a love story, which I thought would be interesting to write that as an old romantic, and I thought that would be an interesting to have a completely different dynamic, but it's set in the same world, and it's examining the same questions, but it's through different types of story.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one is a little bit more complex. I won't bore you with that.
Look forward to reading.
We'll come to that later.
Look forward to reading those, Steve. Steve, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Where can people find out more about your work, and where can they get the books?
Well, eventually they will be on Amazon. At the moment, the best place to go is Smashwords, and you will get that's. And that's just as it's about Smash Words. If you just Google that, you will find it. And if you look me up, if you're Steve Carroll Diaspora, you'll find it. It's also Apple Books, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
It's very funny actually. They've made out that I've written 5 books. They also have my graphic novels there if you're interested in those, but they've got 2 books which I didn't write. They're by some other Steve Carroll, and there's kind of specialist sociological works. I didn't write those. I don't know how big they've lumped that with me, but there's other Steve Carrolls out there. Yeah,
well, that's great. Well, Steve, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you ever so much for coming on. It's certainly given me reading the book has given me a new insight into science fiction, which wasn't personally a genre I sort of read very much, but I've really enjoyed the book. I'm looking forward to the next ones. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. If you'd like to learn more about Steve, I'll put the links on the show notes. And if you want to get his book, please do so. Steve, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thanks for coming on the show.
No problem at all, Bob. It's always a pleasure, and thank you very much.